Welcome all to Stree Manuraksha training. So today we'll be discussing about violence against women, what is multi-generational trauma, its implication, and lifetime trauma. So let's have a look at the learning objectives. So first, let's understand what is violence, what are the different types of violence occurring in different contexts and situations, what is multi-generational trauma, what are its implications and effects, what is lifetime trauma? Let's try to understand making a life chart of the traumatic experiences and its impact. So how to use it to understand the experience of violence in various stages of life. At the end, we'll also try to understand broad ethical and feminist principles to be used in assessment and interventions for women facing violence. So first, let's understand what is violence. The concept of intentionality. So according to World Health Organization, it is the intentional use of physical power or force, threatened or actual. It can be against oneself or another person, or against a group or community that either results in or has a high likelihood of resulting in injury, death, psychological harm, or maldevelopment. So here the catchword is about the intentionality. Where there is a intentional use of some power or force in causing harm to another person or self. However, we should not forget that violence also includes neglect and deprivation. It has often has lifetime consequences in areas of physical and mental health, socio-occupational functioning, economic and social development. Let's understand the typology of violence. So it can be self-directed violence, it can be interpersonal violence, it can happen at a community level. Also, there is something called as collective violence. So what is self-directed violence? So it's a broad term which includes either self-abuse or harm or suicidal thoughts. Basically, here the violence is towards oneself. What is interpersonal violence? So as the word suggests, interpersonal, it includes acts of violence between a family or a partner. So it can happen in the family or between partner. So which includes child maltreatment or intimate partner violence or even the elder abuse. At a community level, it can happen with strangers or acquaintance. So what is collective violence? It is instrumental use of violence by people who identify themselves as members of a group against another group to achieve certain political, economic, or social objectives, which includes war, terrorism, and violent political conflicts between the states or within the states. What are the different types of violence? So we usually speak about physical violence, sexual violence, psychological and emotional violence, controlling and coercive behaviors, stalking and cyber stalking. So what is physical violence? It is the intentional use of physical force with the potential for causing harm, death, disability, injury. It can be done with the use of an object or a weapon and or use of restraints or one's body, size, or strength against another person. What is sexual violence? Any sexual act, attempt to obtain a sexual act, unwanted sexual comments or advances, can be by any person, regardless of the relationship to the victim. It can happen in any setting, including home and workplace. What is psychological and emotional violence? It is the trauma caused by deliberate acts, threats of acts, or coercive tactics, which includes humiliating the victim, controlling the victim's actions. It can be isolating the victim, denying the victim to access basic resources, basic needs. Let's try to understand what is controlling behavior and coercive behavior. So controlling behavior is an act to make a person subordinate, that is at a lower level, dependent by isolating them from sources of support, exploiting the resources and capacities for personal gain and regulating their everyday behavior. So here, the perpetrator usually puts the survivor or the victim at a lower level. So they use a lot of power and control tactics to maintain this violent behavior. What is coercive behavior? So coercive, as the English terminology suggests, it's something like you persuade. It's a continuing act or pattern of acts of assault, threats, humiliation, and intimidation or other abuse that is used to harm, punish, or frighten the victim. So there can be coercive controlling behaviors. So certain examples are: you isolate a person from the family or friends, you deprive them of the basic needs, constantly monitoring that the person, their activities, like where you go, what you do, what you when you if you leave to the workplace, so what you do in the workplace, or who are your friends, what do you do in your leisurely time, taking control of over everyday life, such as where they go, whom they can see, when they can sleep, what they wear, repeatedly putting them down, that is telling them they are worthless, humiliating, dehumanizing them, taking control over the finances. Like if the perpetrator gives certain amount of money, so constantly checking on what the person spent on, what is she doing, how much is she spending, where is she spending, etc. So there can be acts like threat to kill, threat to reveal their private information, forcing them to take in part in the criminal activity. So what is stalking? So stalking is a pattern of unwanted behavior directed at a specific person, which makes them feel afraid, nervous, or they might feel they are in danger. So some of the examples of stalking are: following a person, appearing at a person's home or place of business, making harassing phone calls, leaving written messages or objects, destroying a person's property. So as we live in the era of internet, where most of the things happens in the over the internet, so there is something new terminology called cyber stalking, where the person uses electronic means of communication to harass or frighten someone, like constantly sending threatening emails or messages. So these are the different kinds of violences which we saw. So let's move on to understand the concept of multi-generational trauma. So here the word suggests multi-generation. So what do we understand by multi-generation? It is from generation to generation, how the trauma passes on and what are its implications and effects. So what is multi-generational trauma? It's a process of transmission of trauma from parent figures to their infants or children, resulting in the effects of trauma being experienced by the second generation without exposure the original traumatic experience or event. So how it gets transmitted? It is transmitted via interactional patterns, through genetic pathways, or the family dynamics. So it may occur unintentionally, in very subtle way, through attachment relationships or within the family and the community groups. So it begins with a traumatic event affecting individual, multiple family members, or collective trauma affecting larger communities like war. So let's have a look at the implications and effects of multi-generational trauma at an individual level. So at an individual level, a person can constantly can have a certain mental health issues, like frequent feelings of anger, fear, anxiety, low mood. They can have reduced self-esteem and efficacy. They can also face social isolation and withdrawal. There can be reduced efficiency in socio-occupational functioning. That is, they are not able to execute the work properly. So at a family level, what are the effects we can see because of the multi-generational trauma? At a family level, so we can see continued financial constraints, reduced investment in education, health, and other basic necessities. There can be high noise levels in the family. There can be poor cohesiveness among the family members, where there are constant fights, the family dynamics gets altered, where there is poor interactional patterns, which can have effect on the family. At a community level, what can we see? There can be restricted economic growth. There can be pervasive violence and deprivation. At a society level, failure to meet costs of health. There can be criminal justice and social welfare can be compromised. At a larger level, at a country level, what can be there? The economic growth, the entire country's economic growth can be slowed down. The security of the country can be, security of the nation can be compromised. The social development can be slowed down. There can be socio-economic inequality. So we saw certain implications of multi-generational trauma at various levels. So now let's try to understand the connection between the traumatic events and the poor childhood development. So for example, if there is a constant exposure to abuse and violence, if a child is witnessing violence or has undergone child abuse, there can be certain family dysfunction in that particular family. So as I was telling, there can be the family dynamics can be altered. The interaction styles in the family can be faulty, which can lead to poor parenting styles. Because of this, that particular individual can face health and educational issues, like health can be compromised. So there is neglect of health related issues. So there is neglect of educational related issues, which can again lead to changes in the behavior in a particular individual when he or she is witnessing violence or exposed to violence. So we can see two kinds of behavior. One is something we called it as externalizing behavior, and the other behavior is called as internalizing behavior. Here, the examples of externalizing behavior is like a person can indulge in risky behaviors like truancy, substance use, frequent lying, etc. Internalizing behaviors like there can be symptoms like stammering, bedwetting, etc., which can again put this individual into a socially isolated and marginalized state. As we were discussing about the connection between the trauma and the childhood development, so here we can see high risk of behavioral problems like lying, truancy, problems in relationship. There can be symptoms of physical aggression. So here the truancy means staying away from the school without good reason, basically getting absent in the school, which leads to educational compromise. We can see symptoms like substance abuse. There can be emotional problems like isolation, sadness, helplessness, anxiety, hopelessness. We can also, the child who is exposed to constant violence and abuse and who has witnessed this, so there can be serious implications like self-injurious behavior. So next we'll move on to the concept of lifetime trauma. So what is lifetime trauma? So traumatic events are differentiated from stressful life events by their imputed seriousness. All of us are exposed to stressful life events. So it depends on our resource system, on our support system, like how we cope the stress and come back to a fairly normal life. But however, for some people, it might not happen. Whereas on the other hand, experiencing a traumatic life event can lead to serious consequence that the person might find it difficult to cope with. So let's have a look at certain examples of the traumatic events. There can be severe emotional maltreatment and neglect. There can be bullying. There can be gender disadvantage. There can be presence of any physical deformity or appearance, which constitutes lifetime trauma. Experiencing sexual and physical abuse, witnessing a violent crime, or premature loss of a parent or closed ones, which leads to grief. So these are the certain examples of lifetime trauma. Let's have a look at the lifetime trauma experiences. So the severe trauma effects can lead to dissociation and even flashbacks of the traumatic event. There can be misdiagnosis for severe mental disorders. The lifetime trauma is associated with poor life satisfaction in various studies. There can be overlooking the underlying issues of abuse. There can be risky coping strategies such as substance use, as already discussed. There can be greater vulnerability to experience further trauma. So let's have a look at the factors affecting the trauma cycle. So how this trauma cycle is constantly happening. So what happens in this? So we understood the connection between the trauma and the poor childhood development. So what happens? There can be unresolved conflicts, unprocessed emotions or thoughts about a traumatic event. So here, what we mean is unprocessed is where the particular child or individual has witnessed trauma, has been exposed to trauma, and but however they have not been validated of their emotions, where they are not able to express their emotions, so which constitute the unprocessed emotions or conflicts. There can be negative repeated patterns of behavior like continued violence, which can affect the trauma cycle. There can be poor parent-child relations and emotional attachment because of the trauma, which leads to faulty parenting mechanisms and faulty emotional attachments, untreated or poorly treated substance abuse or severe mental illnesses. There can be complicated personality traits or personality disorders. So now let's try to understand making a life chart for violence. So this is a tool to assess a life chart of violence. So we'll be seeing that how violence was experienced at various stages of life. So let's take an example of this life chart. So let's divide our lives in particular stages. That is probably like 0 to 1 is one stage, 10 to 20 years of our life is another stage, 20 to 30 is another stage, 30 to 40 is another stage, 40 to 50 is another stage. So at 0 to 10 years, so these are the significant life events which have been mentioned. That is the traumatic events which are mentioned. Like from 0 to 10 years, there was chaotic, unloving home. So that particular individual did not receive a love, did not have a loving environment. There were, again, which led to kind of faulty emotional attachments and at various stages. At an early stage itself, there was sex abuse incidents. Then when the particular individual moved on, we could see there were a lot of behavioral problems. As we mentioned, like it can be either internalizing problems or it can be externalizing problems. And another serious problem is about suicidality, that is self-injurious behavior. And again, there was a repeated trauma, that was a sexual abuse incident. There were miscarriages because of the sex abuse. Then this particular individual married. So there was again violence with the partner, that is intimate partner violence. Diagnosed to have HIV. Then there were mental health issues like depression. Then when this particular person moved on to another stage of life, that is 30 to 40 years, there was homelessness, there was robbery. Again, she went on to have certain mental health issues like post-traumatic stress disorder. From 40 to 50 years in this stage of life, she moved back to the husband's house. Again, there was constant domestic violence and sexual violence. So as we can see, these are the signal events, life events that the participant has highlighted, which has shaped the future behaviors. Now we have come to the last part of the session. So it's a very important topic, which we hardly speak about, that is about the feminist principles of assessment and intervention. So what is feminism? So feminism is about all genders having equal rights and opportunities. It is about respecting diverse women's experiences, identities, knowledge, and strengths, and striving to empower all women to realize their full rights. So feminism is one of the oldest movements in the global history. It basically brings down to end gender discrimination and bringing gender equality. What is feminist psychology? Feminist psychology is a subfield of psychology concerned with gender, sex, categories, and sexualities. Feminist psychology critiques historical psychological research as done from a male perspective with the view that males are the norm. So let's have look at the feminist principles of assessment and interventions. So when we speak about feminism, we speak about waves of feminism. The feminist movement which happened at four particular waves. So the first wave, which happened in the late 19th century, this was the first real political movement for the Western world. And these waves, we have to understand, it mainly lies on the American and European events. So here in the first wave, women asked for right to vote and reproductive rights. So they thought that right to vote would preface the access to further rights. So what happened in this wave where women were granted the right to vote in the United States and UK with certain background. The next wave, which happened in 1960s to 70s, where the traditional gender and the family roles were questioned. So here, what we speak about the gender roles, here as the society speaks that the gender, that is the women, are should only perform certain roles, that women have certain roles like caretaking, she's for marriage, she's for household work and other duties. So these were the gender roles and the family roles were questioned in the second waves. So what were the legal milestones in the second wave? So one is the reproductive rights. They got back the reproductive rights, right to equal pay, equal education, advocating to end violence against women. Then comes the third wave, that is more rights to women, welcoming individuality and rebellion, free expression of sexuality. So here we speak about increasing awareness of intersectionality. So basically we speak about which includes the marginalized people of both genders, different races, classes, and sexual orientation. Coming to the last wave, that is the fourth wave, which consists of the Me Too movement, which happened in the social media activism, led to emphasis of inclusivity, empowerment, and freedom. So as we still remember, it happened like this when the Me Too happened, when Me Too movement happened, there was hashtag Me Too or hashtag Yes All Women. That is the campaigns of body shaming, the rape culture. So during the second wave of feminism, violence against women was understood as a condition existing only in the family. So during this second wave of feminism, the important slogan was person is political. The idea that women's individual problems originate in a socio-political context of patriarchy and gender equality. So later, the effect of patriarchy and its role in violence against women was understood. During the third wave, as I explained, violence against women was understood not just as a condition in family, but a problem in the society, where the slogan was moved to the personal is political and calls to make private public. So based on this, emphasis was placed on assessment and understanding each offender to determine appropriate interventions. Also, the historical roots and cultural underpinnings were noted to understand, assess, and intervene on violence against women. Evidence-based interventions were developed to help women facing violence and trauma. The aim is to create an anti-oppressive, power-balanced, and socially just environment to properly tackle violence against women. So let's have a look at the feminist principles of interventions, which will be helpful in our practice. One is about the need for critical consciousness. That is understanding the idea that women's individual problems originate in a socio-political context of patriarchy and gender inequality. So commitment to social change. That is, the feminist therapists encourage clients to take direct action through social activism. So survivors voicing their concerns initiates change in their own lives, the lives of other survivors, and thereby community as a whole, which helps to make a positive impact on the society. Then another principle is the counseling relationship should be egalitarian. So the relationship between the counselor and the therapist and the women is based on authenticity, mutuality, and respect. One important aspect is about the strength-based approach in feminist principle. So here we try to kind of increase the self-esteem of the women, where the individual, we try to help the individual feels more autonomous, empowered, and independent. Like reframing the trauma symptoms as survival strategies and coping with mental health issues rather than pathologizing the individual, which forms the trauma-informed care. So assessment of violence helps counselors understand the depth of the problem, identifying the risk factors, develop realistic safety plans, formulate appropriate counseling plans, reduce the risk, providing tools for educating service providers. So again, to kind of revise, the basic feminist principles to keep in mind while counseling are: trust a woman's experience. Women victims are not guilty for violence they experience. Counseling means not giving advices, but trusting women's self-determination. So we have come to the end of the session. Let's have a question and answer session. Thank you.